On a special edition of Nation to Nation, the Assembly of First Nations elected its national chief.
Perry Bellegarde, 328.
But not without controversy.
We moved on already. We have work to do.
A cabinet minister met with chiefs on election day, and the optics weren't good.
I don't think Carolyn Bennett should have been here today. Not tomorrow would have been okay, not today.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamoran. Welcome to a special edition of Nation to Nation. We're broadcasting from the unceded territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. Yesterday, Perry Bellegarde was re-elected national chief, winning on the second ballot. But there was some drama. Crown Indigenous Relations Minister visited the Alberta caucus. That caused some of Bellegarde's opponents to claim federal interference in the election.
I think this whole election is really tainted with the Crown Minister being involved in the election process, meeting with Chiefs caucuses even before the voting process began. You can object to that all you want, but it reinforces what I've been saying about how this organization is basically controlled by the Trudeau government.
Joining me now is National Chief Perry Bellegarde. Welcome to Nation.
Good to be here, Todd.
Now, during the election yesterday, there was a bit of controversy. Minister Bennett appeared. Her office issued a statement saying there was no intent to influence the election in any way. Of course, some of your opponents jumped on that and said, yes, her appearance here yesterday at the Alberta caucus was inappropriate. What will you be saying to Bennett when you meet her later?
Well, first off, there was all regional caucuses. The chiefs got together from each of the territories and provinces, and it's up to them to who they want in their caucuses. So the Alberta Chiefs invited her. So that's their right. That's their purview. It's their caucus. So the Chiefs wanted her in, so she went in. I think she issued a statement again. They had issues they wanted to talk to her about. That's what they focused on. And even the Alberta Regional Chief issued a statement, that they invited her in. And so that's where that rests. Again, you respect the Chiefs' direction. It's their caucus rooms. And clearly it didn't have any implication or any impact on the election in any way, shape, or form, because there's issues to always talk about with the Crown.
Do you think, though, that her appearance was inappropriate, that just the timing of it shouldn't have happened on the day of the election?
Yeah, again, there's that perception where I just focused on meeting the Chiefs. There's an election going on, and who votes for the national chief is the Chiefs. So I just kept focusing on meeting the Chiefs, talking to them, listening to their issues, concerns. How can we make our AFN better, and how can we be more responsive to their issues and concerns that they identify? So that's what I focused on.
Do you think that, will there be any talk to the Alberta caucus from you and the executive about the timing?
Oh, that's their right. It's an issue. We moved on already. We have work to do. We have momentum going on child welfare. We have to fix that system. We've got momentum going on co-development of languages. We've got to get that done. We have to work out the new fiscal relationship. So let's get the work going, and let's finish off things that we've started. That's where we've got to put our energies.
Okay, well, talking about as you go forward with your second term, what's the number one priority?
Well, number one priority, I always say, closing the gap, in terms of getting the same quality of life for First Nations people as everybody else in Canada. So we need to keep pushing for continued investments in education and training, continued investments in housing, continued investments in ending the boil water supply, developing strategies to deal with the 40,000 children in foster care, and in moving towards more strategies on prevention as opposed to apprehension. So those are some of the priorities going forward. We have to finish off our Languages Act that we're going to be developing with the Crown in terms of our Indigenous Languages Revitalization Act, and that's really about who we are. And so those are some of the things going forward that we want to focus our energy on.
Now, you just mentioned the Indigenous Languages Act. There's all kinds of legislation and policies going on. I know at one of the last meetings, AFN meetings in Ottawa, you seem to express a sense of urgency. We're coming up to the next federal election, October 2019. We got to get some of this stuff done. So what happens if some of this stuff does die on the order paper, whether it's this or it's Bill C-262, UNDRIP?
Right. Well, there is an October 2019 time frame. There is a federal government election. And so we've got commitments from this government, this sitting government, and Prime Minister Trudeau and Cabinet to co-develop a National Indigenous Languages Act. So that seems to be one of the priorities we want to get done. We don't know and can't predict what will happen in October 2019. So at least we want to get something finished and completed so that there is statutory funding in place for Indigenous languages. We don't want a program. We don't want a policy. It's got to be legislation so that we have ongoing sustainable funding so we can use different strategies as to the status and state of our languages. Some are on the verge of extinction, so you have to capture those. Some you want to use language immersion. Some you want to do language tests. Some you want to do the master apprentice model. It depends, but you need statutory funding. So that becomes a priority because we don't want anything to die on the open paper. And so as we go forward to October 2019, we'll be building relationships with all parties, the Liberals, the Conservatives, the NDP, the Greens, because we don't know what will happen. And that's basically the role of the Assembly of First Nations, to advocate for policy and legislative change going forward. That's what we're going to continue to do.
I know you've had Andrew Scheer and Jagmeet Singh at your meetings recently. Have you built enough of momentum with the Liberal government that this can continue in the event that there is a change in government? For example, Andrew Scheer became Prime Minister after October 2019. Do you have that momentum, you think, with the Conservatives? Or are we going to go back to the bad days of the Harper government?
Again, October 2019, nobody can predict what happens. My job will be to influence those party platforms to make sure that First Nations priorities get addressed. Because our priorities are basically Canada's priorities. Because if we don't close that gap I continually talk about, it's not good for our people and it's not good for Canada. Because there's high social cost to maintaining the status quo. So I believe the Liberals get that. I believe the Conservatives get that. I believe the Greens get that, and the NDP. I believe Canadians get that. And that's why there's a lot of support for some of the things we keep talking about. And so we'll work with whoever gets elected in October 2019. But like we say, we've got the most important thing is we've got momentum. Let's get things done, and let's close that gap together.
You talked about rights, how important that is. Of course, there's the Rights Framework Initiative that was announced by the Trudeau government last Valentine's Day. Talked to some of your opponents yesterday, concerned about this. Some First Nations are concerned that it's moving too fast, that these engagement sessions that Minister Bennett's been on back in the spring, it's not including enough people. Should this be slowed down and maybe be pushed past another election?
Well, we're going to take that to our Chiefs in Assembly and take direction from our Chiefs in Assembly at all times. We all want to move beyond the Indian Act. There's no question we all want to move beyond the Indian Act. But there's a process and there's a plan and there's a stage process to that. There's only one piece of legislation that First Nations really feel good about because it's being co-developed. That's the Indigenous Languages Act. We're not co-developing the Rights Reconciliation Framework. We're not co-planning these processes. The Crown's doing it on their own. So the Rights Reconciliation Framework Act is not AFN's, it's the Crown doing it. We're going to have to take control and ownership of that process and involve our people, the chiefs, the leaders, the elders, the youth, the women's council. All of that will have to happen if we're going to breathe life into it. And so that's what I see going forward. Anything that's not done in co-development or partnership with First Nations people probably won't fly. And so that's why we got to take control of that process and involve First Nations people every step of the way if it's going to have a success of being implemented, done in a proper way, so that there's respect for rights and title, for First Nations people. We've got the Chilcotin case that has to be implemented. Rights and title have to be respected and honored. We've got our treaty relationship. So going off on their own doesn't make sense, and so that's some of the work going forward that we've got to really seize the agenda.
Talked about getting First Nations involved in that, but there still seems to be a disconnect out there with the grassroots, especially those who live off reserve. I mean, how can the AFN, what should the AFN be doing better to connect with those people, to answer some of those criticisms that you don't speak for them or you're not doing enough for them? Well,
our Assembly of First Nations is driven by the Charter, AFN Charter. And I always have respect for the office of chief because that's a very high office, because the chiefs represent all their people on and off the reserve, in their territories and outside their territories. They represent their citizens. You have to remember the Corbier decision. Chiefs and council, like the Corbier decision basically said, no matter where you live, you have a right to go vote for and select your chief and councillors. So that's the highest office, chief and council. And our Assembly of First Nations is made up of chiefs that are elected by all their people. So the chiefs represent all their people. So that we have a chiefs organization here, and it's driven by our AFN Charter. I'll always look for ways. How do we make this organization called the AFN better? How can we make it more responsive to issues, concerns identified? How can we make it more relevant to people and respectful of the diversity? So our AFN Charter will be reviewed, and those questions will be asked. And we'll be bringing back recommendations to the Chiefs Assembly because they're the ones that amend the Charter. And so we're going to start that process, and hopefully within a few years we're going to make some amendments to that Charter.
I just want to briefly talk about the work that's going to be done today. There's going to be all kinds of resolutions talked about. But the AFN Youth Council put forward a resolution to oppose the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and there is no resolution on that. Why is that, and where do you stand on this pipeline issue?
Oh, we stand with the rights and title holders, and I've always supported the right to self-determination. That's the most fundamental right we have as Indigenous peoples. I've always said we have the 5 elements for the right to be recognized: our own languages, our own lands, our own laws, our own people, and our own identifiable forms of government. So that right to self-determination means to recognize the right to say yes and or the right to say no. The whole pipeline dialogue and discussion is very divisive. Premiers are fighting each other. Canadians disagree. There's all sides, even with chiefs. So you got to go to the rights and title holders, and that's where that decision rests. It doesn't rest with any council, the Youth Council, Women's Council. It doesn't rest with that. Go to the rights and title holders, and that's where the decision should be made.
I suppose what can you do? Obviously, there are chiefs here at the Assembly today who support it, who want to buy into the pipeline. And of course, those who say, no, it's not going through my territory. I mean, how do you get those together so that some outcome can...
As National Chief, we support both. Like we've talked about equity ownership in major projects, not only pipelines, mines, every big major infrastructure piece. First Nations have to be involved because we can't talk about self-government or self-determination without talking about economic self-sufficiency. And I've said it publicly, First Nations should be involved every step of the way because we'll find the balance between the economy and the environment, always. And I think the sides that are there, you know, if we're involved every step of the way, and if we utilize our ceremonies and traditions to find peace, create the space for dialogue and bring people together and talk and listen respectfully to both sides, you're going to find that common ground. And that's the role of the AFN, is to create that space for dialogue, but leave it up to the decision makers, the rights and title holders. And that's where I'll be putting my energies.
Okay, we're all out of time. I want to thank you for doing this. Thank you for talking to me.
Thanks for the opportunity.
After the break, APTN Investigates executive producer Paul Barnsley analyzes what Bellegarde's victory may mean. Welcome back. Now, to put this whole election, AFN election, into perspective for us, I'm joined now by executive producer of Investigates, Paul Barnsley. And of course, Paul has been covering the AFN for years. He's been at 9 different elections. Welcome to Nation to Nation, Paul. Now, what does this re-election of Perry Bellegarde mean for the AFN going forward?
That means they can keep going with this rather ambitious agenda they've developed with the federal government. I guess it's fair to say it means a lot of people are going to keep their jobs. A lot of money is going to flow into the AFN, and there are critics out there, but there's also the possibility of some really good work, so we'll get a chance to see them finish it off.
What would be at the top of Bellegarde's agenda now that he's got a mandate for a second term?
He kept saying over and over again about close the gap, close the gap.
Of course, he's been saying that for 3 years now.
Yeah, but it's what's guided his response to the arrangement with the feds. And, he listed the same things in his opening speech, his campaign speech, and in his closing speech. He wants better housing, better health care. He wants to go beyond the Indian Act on his own terms. Some people criticize how he's approached that, but he'll get another 3 years to work at it and get it right. He kept saying over and over again, with work to do, there's work to do. He's not even talking about celebrating his victory. He's talking about getting back to work tomorrow morning.
Of course, there was a bit of a controversy surrounding his victory. How surprised were you that Carolyn Bennett controversy didn't affect the second ballot, it looked like?
Not really at all. The people who were supporting Perry were going to support him. They weren't going to let something like that take them off track. It's one of these sort of inside baseball things, and Russ Dibo's leading it because he's a policy wonk. That's what he's always been. But I think there was a problem that may make its way to the House of Commons I don't think Carolyn Bennett should have been here today. Not tomorrow would have been okay. Not today. I think that was a mistake. I think she's going to pay for it at some point. And Perry's going to have to handle some of the blowback because of that. But it seems to me he didn't even refer to it in his victory speech. He's going to move past it as quickly as he can. He is interested in preserving a good working relationship with the federal government, and he just would see this as a distraction, I would think.
Of course, on the other hand, Russ Diabo did mention it in his concession, if you can call it a concession speech. But he also promised that he was going to work from the outside on reforming the AFN. However, I mean, the reaction to what he had to say, there were boos.
Yeah.
What can he do at this point? Has his reputation been diminished, do you think?
I'm not sure. Russ has been a very effective backroom guy for a long time. I mean, if anything, his profile has been raised. His consulting business might do better. But as far as having an effect on things, I mean, he's basically a blogger now. That's, you know, he'll probably still do the First Nation bulletin. He'll have things to say, and maybe reporters will call him a little more often to get his take on things. But I don't think he's going to slow down the momentum that the AFN has under Perry Bellegarde.
Because from what you've said already, maybe Bennett there might be some blowback for her. But in the days, weeks, maybe months going forward, do you think there'll be any blowback whatsoever on Bellegarde over what happened today?
No, I really don't. I really don't. Unless somebody hires a lawyer and finds a way to come up with a concrete complaint, a legal complaint, a dispute that a court will hear. That could hamstring things a bit. But if it was merely an opportunity to use it for political gain, that opportunity's passed now. So it's into the legal realm, or it's into the ether and it's forgotten.
Yeah, you're probably right, and it looks like Bellegarde is well on his way to starting his second term, and it does look like it's going to be business as usual.
Mm-hmm. And they've been busy over there. There's a lot going on. I was at the Assembly in Ottawa in December, and you know, there was so many different tracks they're working on that they were talking about between Minister Philpott and Minister Bennett. There may be other things in other ministries, for all I know. I've lost track. There's so many balls in the air.
There's working groups with the senior cabinet ministers, of course, going on and whatnot. And you're right, it's going to be a busy time for Bellegarde, and that relationship isn't going to change. Perhaps it'll even get closer, I don't know.
It's quite possible.
Well, thanks for doing this, Paul. Thank you.
My pleasure.
After a short break, we'll have a conversation with the new Ontario Regional Chief for the AFN, Ann Archibald. Welcome back. Ann Archibald is the AFN's Regional Chief of Ontario. She's the first woman to hold the position, and is still a relative newcomer, having been on the job for about a month. Archibald became Regional Chief at about the same time Doug Ford became Ontario's Premier. Ford hasn't exactly built bridges with the province's Indigenous people yet. To talk about that and other things, I'm joined now by Regional Chief Ann Archibald. Regional Chief, welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you.
Now, what do you think resonated with the voters who got you in? What was it that, I suppose, led to you beating Isidore Day?
Well, we have very different styles of leadership, and I believe that that's what resonated, that there was a belief that there was time for change in Ontario, and I best represented that change, I think. Now,
of course, you got elected around the same time, as I mentioned, Premier Ford was elected, and you actually briefly met him at a scrum, and you offered him some tobacco. Why did you feel you had to do that?
Well, I actually met him twice, and the first time I met him, tobacco, as you know, is a sacred offering. It holds our prayers, and it's our connection to our ancestors. And when I think about a PC government, and if we look at the history of those relationships, I want to be able to transform those and have positive relations and to build bridges with Doug Ford and his government. So I felt like that spiritual offering was really important as a starting place.
Because I guess we don't have to remind viewers that when there was a PC government under Mike Harris, that's when Ipperwash happened, and that's when the death of Dudley George happened. I imagine it's too early to say if we're going to go down the same path as that government.
I don't believe we will. I do feel that I always want to give people the benefit of the doubt. We're in the age of reconciliation, and the knowledge base about who we are as First Nations has been elevated in recent years especially, and I feel like that new environment that we all live in will allow us to have better relationships. That's my hope moving forward.
How concerned are you that the Indigenous affairs is now part of Mines and Energy and Northern Development? It's been, which is opposite to what happened at the federal level where Northern Affairs has been taken out of Minister Bennett's portfolio. Mm-hmm. Does that concern you at all?
Well, I've said in the past that when we look at Minister Greg Rickford, he's from the north. He knows our communities. Of all the candidates, I'd say in Ontario, he's probably the best candidate to hold those portfolios, and particularly Indigenous affairs. And in terms of that dynamic, yes, it could be a bit of a conflict, I believe, in some cases. I'm always an optimist, though. I really see that there could be something good that would come out of being able to talk to the Minister of Indigenous Affairs while talking about the development of the North. So I think that there's something positive that can be seen there.
And of course, talking about the development of the North during the campaign, Ford promised to get on the bulldozer himself and build the road to Northern Ontario to develop mining. Obviously, that's probably just rhetoric, but do you think that is going to be maybe perhaps a source of conflict as we move forward?
I don't believe so. I do believe it was rhetoric, and I know that, again, we live in the age of reconciliation. We have so many court cases that we have won through the Supreme Court. We have we have a recent actual provincial win on consultation in Ontario. We have the United Nations Declaration, and under there we have free, prior, and informed consent. So consent is really at the heart of what I see happening when it comes to development, and that's where we come from, that the Ford government has to seek our consent. They may not agree with that, but that's going to be what we feel has to happen, because the communities that are affected by development, in that immediate area, have to give their consent. They have to say that that development's okay.
Well, we'll have to see how what happens going forward. I think Premier Ford is going to get an education, and I'm assuming you're going to help educate them. Mm-hmm. Last question I want to ask is, how do you feel about the direction the Assembly of First Nations is going? You now sit on the executive, so how do you feel about things?
Well, I really want to make sure, as the Ontario Regional Chief, that the issues that really matter to Ontario are brought forward to the National Executive, and that we find a real cooperative way to meet all of our objectives. I mean, this is an expansive, big country, and it's diverse. Our First Nations are diverse. They don't always agree on everything. And so I really see my role as building those bridges with other regions across Canada.
We'll be back in the fall with regular episodes of Nation to Nation in the lead up to the next federal election, October 2019. I'm Todd Lamoran. Have a great evening.